This is Alex, and I welcome you to Socialism Survival Podcast number 11. In this podcast, I'll be talking about socialism and religious freedom. This subject is very important to me now, as it was important 18 and more years ago to me and to many others who took their faith in God seriously, who stood firm on the position that compromise with ungodly system is a sin. But before I continue, let's do some virtual housekeeping. I appreciate you as my listeners, and I'm trying to make this part of the podcast as short as I can. So please connect with me through my website at socialismsurvival.com. There you'll find all my podcasts, blogs, and you will be able to connect with me on Twitter, Facebook, Google Friends Connect, and other sites. On contacts page there, you'll find my email and also Google Voice application, so you can call me directly from my website and leave your voice message. Please also check out lanternsofliberty.us website, where Socialism Survival has also its representation. Okay, back to the subject. Please, when you listen to this podcast, understand that I'm not just expressing my opinion as an outside observer, but I share with you my personal experience, facts that were part of Soviet socialistic reality to so many Soviet people who went through the firestorms of persecutions and remained faithful to God and their own conscience. Let's look closely at ugliest phase of atheism, the Soviet one. Karl Marx declared, and Lenin repeated, that religion is opium for the people. While Marx referred to opium as something that helps those suffering in pain, that helps to calm children, as opium was used at the times, it looks like Lenin was more familiar with opium's misuse by drug addicts. And therefore, in order to uproot and destroy addiction to pain-relieving religion, he inflicted decades of pains and painful suffering upon millions of God-fearing, God-loving Soviet people. Let's see Marx's quote in Opium of the People context. Quote, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness." End of quote. Earlier, in same context, Marx wrote that state and society produce religion. In the context of the human-made system of beliefs called religion. I would agree with Marx that religion does not bring real happiness, just temporary relief, an illusion of everything being well. But I strongly disagree that socialism can give any happiness at all. It is even more illusory than any religious promises. While using the word religion in this podcast as a general term to substitute the repetitive usage of many words and terms together, such as church, synagogue, Christianity, Judaism, worship, expression of faith in God, prayer, Bible study, etc. I personally believe that God is the source of real happiness, not religion. But I also believe that people within society have the right to organize as church or synagogue or any other kind of congregation to worship together God, who is the source of their happiness. And here in this podcast, for convenience, I am also using word religion for such organized form of worship. Next to Lenin in Soviet history stands another ungodly figure. His name, Yemelyan Mikhailovich Yaroslavsky. His real name, Minei Israelevich Gubelman, who was revolutionary and member of the Central Committee of Soviet Communist Party, ideologist and leader of USSR atheist movement. From 1925 and until his death in 1943, he was the chairman of the Union of Militant Godless. In 1937, he published Bible version of atheism, Bible for believers and unbelievers. It was the title, which in its context is open mockery of everything sacred for Christians and Jews. He also was main initiator and executor of such Soviet anti-religious policies as destruction of churches and synagogues or desecration by converting them into clubs, warehouses, barns, etc. From that godless movement organized by Yaroslavsky, atheists as anti-religious propagandists, financed by Communist Party, flooded whole USSR with their poison, having green light to speak and distribute their literature in schools, colleges, universities, workplaces, collective farms, both individually to people and especially set up meetings. And of course, they were always right, no matter how wrong and stupid were their speeches. Those who dared to oppose them publicly ended up in Gulag. While many people were in Gulag being falsely accused, it was different with believers. Most of them were persecuted for who they were and what they did. Believers were in Gulag for being believers, for praying to God, for studying Holy Scriptures, for printing and distributing Bibles and other spiritual literature. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his Gulag Archipelago, describes strong spirit and high moral level of believers he met in the camps. In podcast number 8, I already shared with you survival stories of my father and grandfather who were in Gulag for their faith in God and who remained faithful to God and His commandments. At all Soviet times, as far as I know, any organized religious group was prohibited unless was registered with the governmental Office of Religious Affairs. Those who agreed to register also agreed to provide and periodically update membership list, to report annual offerings amount, and to abide by all rules and regulations imposed upon believers by Communist Party, such as not to preach or pray outside of congregational building or own home, not to conduct religious services in any other place except in officially registered place such as church building, not to expose Bible or other religious items in public places. Why? Because people are curious and from that point preaching can be started and some people can be converted from atheism to God's faith. Next, not to prohibit their children to be a part of communist youth groups and to wear red star or red pioneer tie. If the children they wanted to be a part of that groups, parents were not allowed to prohibit that. Next rule, to report any anti-Soviet activity within their group, and many other rules. Such compliant people were allowed to possess Bibles, New Testaments, and other literature approved by KGB in the hands and homes of other non-compliant believers. Bible was considered as anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Homes, bags, and purses of such people were subject to searches, and everything found there was confiscated if it was considered anti-Soviet propaganda. Such search was conducted in our home too. My Bible was confiscated and I never got it back. Actually, if Bible was printed in Moscow by governmental printing house, it was only allowed version that avoided confiscation. Of course, to find such version was a very difficult task. KGB worked tirelessly trying to recruit informers in such unregistered groups. They simply called that group sects. When they got information about time and location of upcoming meetings, usually in somebody's home at night, they would send there a group of militia who would disrupt the service, write everyone's names, take Bibles and other literature, and of course, always find the house owner, usually between 1/3 and half of his monthly income. And these were considered merciful measures. Many stories were told and written about terrible things done by a group of drunken militia volunteers who would enter the house during the service, beat everyone with sticks and lead knuckles, spit and pee on holy items and even on people, order women to undress, and sometimes even rape them. Such was the harsh reality for those whose only crime was their faith in God. And of course, many times the preachers, pastors, rabbis, they were arrested and sent to camps or even killed during interrogations. Persecuted believers were often stripped of their parental rights. During Stalin's rule, when both parents were sent to camps as the enemies of Soviet state, then the children of such enemies were sent to special children's camps. In post-Stalin era, children were put in orphanages or special boarding schools. Many little kids were fostered in communist families with their names changed so that parents or other relatives would never find them. Who can imagine the pain of such separation? Who will ever measure the rivers of mother's tears? Will you be able to look in those empty eyes that had no more tears if you will allow such things to happen here in your country? Names of believers who were caught in underground services were reported to their workplaces. Such report would require employer to punish his guilty employee by lowering his position or cutting down his pay, by issuing public reproach, warning, often in front of other employees. Severe trials awaited believers in Soviet army, especially those whose faith didn't allow them to take oath or to handle weapons. Many families received home their sons in zinc-plated caskets without permission to open it. When, in spite of prohibition, casket was opened, everyone's eyes were caught by a terrible view of tortured body. One such remarkable story that was known to every Christian in Soviet Union is the story of Ivan Moiseev. He was a 20-year-old Baptist who loved God and wasn't afraid to preach to other soldiers and even officers during his army service. He was beaten, wounded, tortured with heated iron and ice-cold water. And then, on July 16, 1972, still alive, he was forcefully drowned in Black Sea, near Kerch City, which is on Crimean Peninsula. Autopsy showed violence as a reason of his death. My own life was threatened during Soviet army service, and it is nothing but the miracle that I am still alive. I may tell you my whole story in one of my future podcasts. In schools and colleges, believers were treated differently from other students. Other students were incited against them by using mockery, curse, and propagandistic instigation. Often, believers were dragged in schools' public toilets and beaten there, just simply for being believers who opposed socialism, atheism, evolution. Heroic patience of God's people during these trials put on them by Soviet socialistic regime had its abounded fruits. Witnessing such boldness and faithfulness to God, some interrogators and KGB officers became, whether secret or open, followers of God. Some of them later also died for their faith. Also, neighbors and accountants of these people who suffer, seeing their faith and their honest, pure lives, were drawn to faith in God. Stalin's one of the most cruel commissars, Henryk Yagoda, who was born in Jewish family as Yenon Gershevich Yaguda, who was the head of the NKVD, which is Soviet Union's Soviet Internal Affairs and Border Guards body. So he was the head of that system from 1934 to 1936, and he was himself arrested. When asked by his interrogator if he believed in God, Yagoda replied, "From Stalin I deserved nothing but gratitude for my faithful service. From God I deserved the most severe punishment for having violated his commandments thousands of times. Now look where I am and judge for yourself. Is there a God or not?" And before his execution, he proclaimed from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Yemelyan Yaroslavsky's death was as awful as of King Herod. He was eaten by worms alive. On his deathbed, having his spiritual eyes opened and understanding the punishment of God for all the evil he has done, he implored Stalin, "Burn all my books. You see, the Holy One, he is waiting on me for so long. He is here. Burn my books." As my Bible verse of the week, I'd like to continue the quote of Yenon Yaguda, known as Henryk Yagoda. And continuation is in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." This was exactly what those Soviet martyrs did, loving God the way you just heard, and paying for freedom to worship Him with their lives, remaining forever free. This week, instead of anecdote, I'd like to tell you the story of one preacher who was speaking about God to Soviet soldiers. After he was arrested, Soviet interrogator asked him, "For how long you will defend your foolish religion?" The man answered, "I saw many atheists who on their deathbed prayed to God, regretting of their godless lives. Can you imagine dying Christian, regretting for always being a Christian? And who would pray to Marx or Lenin to save him from his faith?" "Smart answer," interrogator replied, laughing. Preacher then showed him some passages in Lenin's works where it proves that even Lenin himself prayed while facing difficult times. This was part 1 on socialism and religious freedom. Thank you for listening to this podcast. To listen to other podcasts, please go to socialismsurvival.com or subscribe using iTunes, Feedburner, and through podcast.com website. God bless you and keep you now and in difficult times that are coming. Be faithful to God, the true source of your happiness.